Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. My name is Lauren, and for 3 years I worked the closing shift at a little roadside bar tucked into a bend of the highway that cuts through the Appalachian Mountains. If you've ever driven those roads at night, you know the feeling. Black tree line pressing in on both sides, the occasional porch light up on a ridge, truck headlights carving through the fog like they're the only real thing left in the world. Our place sat just past a blind curve, a squat brick rectangle with a flickering neon beer sign and a gravel lot that opened into the dark woods behind it. Locals called it the Switchback because of the way the road curled around the hill, but it wasn't the kind of bar that showed up on any travel blog. Inside, it was low ceilings, old country songs on the jukebox, the same regulars nursing the same cheap whiskey, truckers passing through, and the odd-lost tourist who took the wrong exit and decided a drink sounded easier than turning around. I actually liked it. The routine was steady. The tips were surprisingly good for a place where most people paid in crumpled bills, and I'd gotten used to reading people fast. The lonely talkers, the harmless flirts, the quiet drinkers who wanted to disappear for an hour, and the ones you just knew not to push. Weekend nights, my coworkers were around, and the place felt rowdy in a familiar way. But during the week, my boss kept it lean. On Tuesdays and Wednesdays, it was just me behind the bar from 9 until close, with him 15 minutes away at home down the mountain and a grainy set of security cameras watching the doors. Out there with the highway humming and the woods pressing in, you learn to stay alert. Wed had a couple of fights before. A few guys who'd had too much and wanted to take something out on somebody, and Id had to get good at drawing lines with a smile. Maybe that's why I noticed him as soon as he stepped through the door. It was a little after 1 in the morning on a Tuesday, slow enough that the ice in the well had barely melted since 11. He walked in like he knew exactly where he was going, but still took a second to let his eyes adjust to the dark. Late 40s, I'd guess, though it was hard to tell. He was one of those men who seemed like they'd never let themselves go soft. Clean cut in a way that almost didn't match the town. Dressed in a dark charcoal turtleneck and a coat that looked expensive but understated, not flashy. He had that quiet, organized kind of money about him, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. His posture was almost perfect, shoulders straight, movements precise as he crossed the room and took a seat at the bar. No swagger, no fumbling, like this was just one more appointment in a well-planned day. He scanned the bottles behind me once and ordered one of the priciest scotches we kept, no hesitation. When I poured it, he asked if I liked working there, like he genuinely wanted to know. It was such a normal question that it disarmed me. I told him I did, that the nights could be long, but the view driving home wasn't bad, and I made some throwaway joke about being practically part-time therapist, part-time bartender. I remember thinking that he reminded me of the kind of dad you'd see at a Little League game, the one clapping for everybody's kid, not the type who usually came in alone at 1 in the morning off a mountain highway. He was easy to talk to, polite without being stiff, and he listened more than he spoke. When he asked if I'd ever thought about doing something bigger, it sounded almost like a teacher checking in on an old student. It was a weird question, sure, but not the creepiest thing I'd ever heard in that room. I gave my practiced smile and told him I was fine where I was for now. Something about my answer seemed to disappoint him in a way I couldn't quite read, like I hadn't given the response he was expecting on a test I didn't know I was taking. After a small pause, he asked what time I usually got off. That was when my stomach tightened, just a little. Up until then, Head had this dad at the ballpark energy, and suddenly he was asking the same question he'd heard 100 times from guys who thought buying 3 rounds entitled them to my Friday night. I kept my tone light and vague, sometime between 2 and 3, depending on the crowd, and then broke eye contact, suddenly very interested in a sticky ring on the counter that needed wiping. He didn't push. He just gave this small, knowing smile, finished his drink in one slow swallow, and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He laid it on the bar like Head just dropped a 10, nodded once, and walked back out into the dark. The whole interaction took maybe 20 minutes. but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. It wasn't anything he said. It was how out of place he felt, like someone had dropped a corporate headshot into a stack of mugshots. When I scooped up the bill, my skin prickled a little. Underneath it, stuck to the bar with the condensation from his glass, was one of our branded coasters. On the blank side, in neat block letters, my name was written. Not Honey, not Bartender, but Lauren, underlined once. I was sure I hadn't told him my name. I flipped it over, expecting a phone number or something, but there was nothing else. Just my name. I told myself I was being dramatic, tossed the coaster into the trash, and went back to rinsing glasses. I figured had been a one-time blip, a story to tell my coworkers the next shift and then forget. A week later, he came back, and he wasn't alone. It was another Tuesday, slow enough that Id counted the bills in the tip jar twice, just to have something to do. The jukebox was mumbling some old Eagles song when the door swung open and the cold came in with them. He walked in first, same unbothered pace, but my attention snagged on the woman at his shoulder. She looked mid-30s, dressed like Shed, studied photos of casual night-out outfits from 5 different Instagram accounts and tried to merge them all. Trendy, but just slightly off jeans that were a little too new. A leather jacket that didn't quite fit her shoulders. Jewelry that looked expensive but clashed. There was something practiced in the way she moved, like Shed decided exactly how much space to take up before she walked through the door. As I set napkins down in front of them, she leaned in across the bar with a smile that dialed up too fast, like a light switch instead of a sunrise, and told me I was pretty. Her fingers brushed my wrist just a little too long when she reached for her drink, nails perfectly manicured. I laughed and thanked her because that's what you do. But from the first 30 seconds, I knew something was wrong with her. Her eyes were bright and wide, but they didn't seem interested in anything but my face. The man barely spoke, which felt even stranger considering how chatty had been the week before. She took over the conversation, asking the kind of questions that sound like small talk if you're not paying attention. How long he'd worked there, if I grew up in town, whether I lived alone or had roommates, how late I usually stayed after close. Her smile never slipped once, not even when I answered vaguely. More than once she glanced sideways at him, and I swear I watched an entire conversation pass between them without a word. At one point, while I turned to grab a bottle, I caught a glimpse of them on the security screen mounted in the corner. The camera that watched the front entrance had a narrow view of the parking lot, just enough to show a black SUV backed into the farthest shadowy corner of the gravel, nose pointed toward the highway instead of the bar. Its headlights were off, but I could see a faint glow inside, like a phone screen or a cigarette. I remember thinking how strange it was to back in like that instead of pulling up toward the door. When I looked back, the woman was watching me watch the screen. Her smile sharpened. She lowered her voice and told me she ran an exclusive event club, the kind of thing she said you couldn't really talk about online. She said they were always looking for young, fun people, for private parties in cabins and big houses tucked further up in the hills, that a girl like me could make 10 grand in a weekend just for showing up and having a good time. She said the words fun and safe and discreet like Shed rehearsed them in a mirror. I laughed it off, told her it sounded too good to be true, that I liked my boring little bar. She assured me there were lots of girls like me already doing it, that she only picked people who were smart enough to understand the rules. While she talked, the man watched my hands like he was noting what I did when I was nervous, how I wiped the same spot on the bar over and over. Then she suggested I step outside for a second to meet someone who could explain it better, and the bottom dropped out of my stomach. The woods beyond our parking lot were black shapes and bramble, with only that one SUV sitting patient in the dark. I didn't bother with the polite lie. I told her straight that I was fine where I was and that I wasn't stepping outside with anyone. The words came out firmer than I expected, like my body had decided for me. Right then, a group of locals came stumbling in, loud and laughing, and I watched the woman's smile falter for half a second before she slid off the bar stool. She brushed invisible dust off her jacket. Didn't argue, just said they'd be back another time. As they left, I noticed something that hadn't been there an hour before. On the inside of the front door, right at eye level, someone had taped up a missing person flyer. A young woman in her 20s in a diner uniform. photographed somewhere that looked like it could have been any other Appalachian town. She had the same tired smile I'd seen in the mirror, plenty of closing shifts. Printed under her picture was the name of a county 2 hours east of us. I hadn't seen anyone put the flyer up. I tore it down and set it behind the bar, my hand shaking a little more than I wanted to admit. After my shift, I told my boss and coworkers about the pair, about the club, about the SUV backed in like it was poised to leave fast. We agreed to keep an eye out, to call him right away if either of them showed up again. My boss promised he was always close and reminded me we had cameras. Has a good man, but you can only lean so hard on 15 minutes away when you're standing alone in a building with the highway humming and the tree line watching. I tried to let it go, but a few nights later, just after 2, when I flipped off the beer sign and stepped into the cold, my heart sank. Across the road, just beyond the reach of our parking lot light, sat a black SUV, engine off, no headlights, facing the bar. You know when you can feel eyes on you, even through glass and distance? The hairs on my arms stood up. I walked to my car with my keys threaded between my fingers, counting my breaths, telling myself it was a coincidence, that lots of people drove black SUVs. When I pulled out and headed down the mountain, the SUV rolled out a few seconds later, careful as a shadow. It kept its distance, never tailgating, never overtly closing the gap. But every curve I took, every turnoff I passed, it was still there when I checked the mirror. On those roads, there aren't many places to go, just hollers, old coal roads, and the occasional gravel drive. I took a random right toward a little church I knew sat on a hill. The SUV turned too. My palms were slick on the steering wheel. Instead of going all the way to the church, I looped back to the highway another way, hoping to throw them off, but when I merged again, their headlights slid into view behind me like they'd never left. That was the first time I really believed I might not make it home. There's a tiny police station down in the valley, a squat brick building with 2 cruisers usually parked out front. I didn't think. I just turned into the lot faster than I probably should have, tires crunching hard over the gravel. The SUV hesitated at the edge of the driveway, then glided past without stopping, disappearing around the bend like it had never been there. I sat in my car shaking, fingers locked so tight around the wheel that my knuckles hurt, watching the empty road and wondering whether they'd circle back. No one ever did. For a few weeks, nothing happened. I went to work, I drove home. I tried to convince myself I'd overreacted. Then one slow Wednesday night, close to midnight, the front door creaked open and she walked in alone. The woman from the SUV. The missing person flyer was still behind the bar, tucked under the register, and just knowing it was there made my throat tighten. I slid my phone out under the counter and texted my boss with hands that suddenly felt clumsy. She's here. Come now. When I looked up, the woman was sitting in the same spot as before, hands folded neatly, smile turned up to that familiar, unnatural brightness. She told me she'd come to check on me, like we were old friends and it'd been rude not to return a call. I told her we were about to close, that I couldn't serve her. She tilted her head and asked for just one old-fashioned, her voice softening, like she was doing me a favor by making it easy. I thought about refusing outright, but I also knew every second I kept her sitting at that bar was another second closer to my boss pulling into the lot. So I turned to grab the bourbon, counting slowly in my head, breathing around the knot in my throat. That's when I heard the front door click shut. No bell, no goodbye, just a soft snick of metal and wood. When I spun around, her bar stool was empty. The room felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with ghosts and everything to do with intent, like the air itself was holding its breath. I stepped toward the entrance and saw it through the glass. A black van now, not an SUV, idling just outside the pool of yellow light. Its windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see anything inside, but I could feel the eyes. Without thinking, I slammed the lock on the front door. A second later, from the back of the building, I heard it, the metallic rattle of someone testing the rear service door, then a heavier thud like a shoulder hitting metal. The bar suddenly felt very small and very empty. I grabbed the first thing that had weight, a metal shaker, and clutched it in one hand while I dialed 911 with the other, my voice pulling tight as I told the dispatcher where I was and that someone was trying to get in. As I moved toward the back hallway, the rattling grew more frantic, then stopped for a heartbeat. In that brief silence, I heard something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The faint scrape of footsteps just under the small barred window in the back door, followed by the slow smear of a hand dragging across the glass. Later, on the camera freeze frame, you could see it clearly, 4 long, greasy prints, like someone had pressed their palm there and grinned. I was trying to decide whether to barricade myself in the office or make a run for the front door when headlights swept across the front windows, bright and familiar. My boss' old pickup. The banging cut off mid-hit. By the time Head jumped out of the truck and Id unlocked the door to let him in, the van was already fishtailing out of the lot, gravel spitting from its tires as it roared toward the highway. My boss caught the plate number, or thought he did, and when the deputies arrived, we sat with them in the tiny office, watching the footage back. Somehow, seeing it on screen made it worse. The woman walking in alone, sitting there with that perfect smile, the moment she glanced up at the camera before she vanished from the frame, as if she knew exactly where it was. 2 figures in dark clothes and masks crouched just outside the front door, waiting for it to open. Another at the back door, pounding with a fist that left smears on the metal. In one frame, the one from the little rear window, you could see part of a face behind the mask, just an eye crinkled in what looked horribly like amusement. When they ran the plate number my boss had given them, it came back as unregistered, nothing in the system. One of the deputies mentioned, almost offhand, that a girl had gone missing a few months back from a bar 2 towns over, off another stretch of the same highway. When he showed me the digital copy of her flyer, my chest went cold. Not because she looked like me, she didn't, but because in one of the photos pulled from her social media, she was behind a bar, laughing at something off camera. In the far left edge of the frame, half cut off, you could see a woman's shoulder and the edge of a leather jacket, fingers with perfect nails resting on the counter. It could have been anyone, but I knew nothing ever came of it, not officially. The van was never found. No one was arrested. My boss doesn't schedule anyone alone at night anymore. Not just me, but any of the staff. He installed better lighting in the lot, better locks on the doors, better cameras. People in town still drift in and out. The jukebox still plays the same tired songs. The highway still hums outside like it always has. But some nights, when I'm driving one of those curves alone and a pair of headlights hangs a little too long in my rear view, all I can see is that black van idling just beyond the edge of the light and the neat block letters of my name on a coaster I threw away. I still don't know how they knew it'd be alone that first Tuesday, or how he knew my name, or how many other exclusive events started with a quiet conversation and ended with a missing flyer taped to a door. I just know that if Id stepped outside when she asked, or if Id run through the front door in a panic instead of locking it, my story might have ended in a gravel lot halfway up a mountain instead of in my own living room. If you've ever worked nights in a place like that, or if something like this has ever brushed up against your life, I'm curious, would you have noticed what I did? Or do you think you would have gone outside? Tell me in the comments. Because sometimes I still lie awake, wondering how close I came, and whether I'd see the warning signs again. Story 2. I used to work the night shift at a tiny fuel stop tucked off a quiet stretch of highway that wound through the Appalachian hills. A place most people only saw because they'd taken the wrong turn or pushed their gas tank too far. My name is Daniel, and for a while, that station felt like my own little island. A box of flickering fluorescent light dropped in the middle of endless dark woods and low mountains. We had 4 pumps, a narrow strip of parking lot, and a store that smelled like burnt coffee and floor cleaner, with shelves lined with stale snack cakes and motor oil. Once the sun dipped behind the ridge, the town might as well have disappeared. The only signs of life were the occasional 18-wheeler grumbling past and the neon open 24 hours sign buzzing in the window. I didn't mind it at first. Nights were simple. Restock chips, mop the floors, check dates on milk, and ring up the random trucker or overnight driver passing through. I liked the quiet more than I liked people. And there was something oddly peaceful about standing behind the counter, listening to the soft hum of the coolers while the cameras cycled through their grainy views of the lot and the tree line. Still, it wasn't lost on me that there was a history in that place. The older guys who trained me didn't talk about it much, but every once in a while they'd mention, almost casually, that things had happened there before. On my second week, when I stepped outside to smoke on my break, I noticed faint dark stains in the concrete near the side of the building. Old and scrubbed, but not gone, trailing toward the woods. Next to the back door, in the metal frame, there were 3 deep gouges like someone had tried to pry it open with a crowbar and given up. When I asked, one of my coworkers shrugged and muttered something about a robbery years back, about a clerk who didn't make it and a security tape that never resurfaced after the police took it. They said it like they were telling me what days the trash was picked up. After that, I became painfully aware of every lock, every camera angle, every blind spot. I remember the night it happened with that kind of sharp clarity your brain saves for car accidents and funerals. It was a little after 2:30 inches the morning, one of those cold, damp nights when the air feels heavier than usual and the fog sits low over the road like it's trying to swallow sound. Business had completely dried up by then. Even the long-haul drivers had moved on. He had already wiped down the coffee station twice and was leaning against the counter, scrolling through my phone just to stay awake. The highway outside was nothing but a dark ribbon threading between the hills. And beyond the pumps was just a wall of trees climbing up into the black. At one point, I stepped outside for some air, hugging myself against the chill, watching my breath puff out and vanish under the buzzing canopy lights. The lot was empty except for my car parked around the side, the pumps standing in a row like metal sentries, and that endless tree line beyond the edge of the asphalt. The neon sign above the door flickered in this half-hearted way, and I remember thinking that if it ever went out for good, no one would notice for hours. I was about to turn back in when something twitched at the edge of my vision. At first I thought it was the leftover movement in my eyes from scrolling on my phone, but when I looked again, there was a shape standing behind one of the pumps. I actually flinched because I couldn't understand how I hadn't seen him there when I first walked out. He was wearing a dark red hoodie with the hood pulled up, hands buried deep in the pockets, shoulders slightly hunched like he was either freezing or trying not to be recognized. There was no car at the pump, no vehicle anywhere, actually. Just him and the wind pushing a candy wrapper across the cracked concrete. He wasn't walking toward the store, either. He was half-turned toward the building, head angled in my direction, like he'd been watching me the whole time. For a second, I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe Head walked over from somewhere up the road. Maybe he was waiting for a ride. But something about the way he shifted bothered me. He didn't pace or fidget like a normal anxious person. He sort of rotated in a slow, aimless circle, dragging the toe of his shoe along the ground, as if he was rehearsing where to stand. The distance between us felt wrong, too far enough away that I couldn't see his face clearly, but close enough that I couldn't pretend he wasn't focused on me. I decided it'd feel safer with a counter between us, so I went back inside, locking the door out of habit more than intention, and watched him through the glass while pretending to check the lottery tickets. Under the harsh white lights, he looked even stranger. He never pulled out a phone, never looked at the pumps or the pricing signs, just drifted slightly from one pump to another like he was waiting for a cue. The cameras over the register showed him as a grainy figure in a red blur, head always slightly down. Minutes passed like that, stretching thin. I remember hoping a trucker or even a drunk local would pull in just so I wouldn't be the only person he was focused on. Eventually, he started toward the door, slow at first. Then with a weird snap of decision like Head finally hit play in his head. He pushed inside without hesitation, and the bell above the door chimed in this painfully normal way that almost made me laugh. Up close, he looked younger than he'd expected, maybe late 20s, but there was nothing boyish about him. His skin had that sallow, sleep-deprived cast that could have meant drugs or just bad living, and his eyes were restless, tracking my hands, my shoulders, the corners of the store in quick flickers. He just stared at me for a few long seconds, like he was memorizing my face. And then in this rushed, stumbling way, he told me his car had broken down right before the pumps. He needed a jump, he said. or maybe some gas. Just enough to get to the next town down the highway. The story didn't land. For one thing, I'd just been outside and there had definitely not been a car. For another, he delivered it like a script head, only half practiced, the words tumbling over each other too fast, then stopping abruptly so he could watch my reaction. I offered to call a tow truck, because that's what we're supposed to do when someone's stranded. The no came too fast, his head jerking in this sharp little motion. He said he just needed a flashlight, maybe someone to help him look under the hood. Nothing big. The way he said it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just what he wanted. It was how intently he watched my face. Every word I said was being analyzed for something I couldn't see. I asked him where the car was parked, fully expecting his story to fall apart, and he said it was just beyond the highway entrance, out of view from the front of the store. I didn't believe him until he pointed behind me at the monitor, showing our outside cameras. When I turned to look, my stomach dropped. Sure enough, there it was, a sedan parked just off to the side of the entrance, far enough from the pumps that someone pulling into the lot wouldn't immediately notice it, angled toward the woods. The headlights were off, the car dark and still. For a split second, I doubted myself. Maybe he really was in trouble. Maybe he'd just been too wrapped up in my own head to notice a whole vehicle when I stepped outside. Then, something moved near the back bumper. On the screen, barely visible in the fuzzy black and white footage, I saw a shape shift and settle again. Someone was crouched, just out of full view, behind the rear of the car, their outline blending into the shadows. It was such a small movement that if I hadn't happened to be staring at the monitor, I might have missed it. A cold wash of dread rolled over me, the kind that starts in your stomach and crawls up your spine. My mind split in two. One part of me smiling and nodding, the other screaming that the only reason you crouch behind a stranger's car on a deserted highway at 2:30 a.m. is because you want to surprise someone. And not in a good way. I forced my voice to stay, even as I said I'd be happy to help, but that I needed to grab my phone from the back office first. I turned slowly, trying not to send any visible signal that I knew exactly what was happening, and the second his reflection slipped out of my direct line of sight, my hand shot under the counter and slammed the emergency panic button. The alarm went off instantly, this high, piercing shriek that filled the store and shuddered in my bones. I'd never heard it before except in training, and hearing it in real life was nothing like the neat little demonstration they gave us. It sounded feral, like the building itself was screaming. I braced for him to rush the counter or try to grab me. Instead, he did something worse. His entire body language changed. The fake jittery energy drained out of him. He straightened up, shoulders loose, hands still in his pockets, and for a heartbeat, he just looked at me. Then he smiled. It wasn't embarrassed, like he'd been caught in a stupid lie, and it wasn't panicked, like someone realizing they'd made a mistake. It was slow and deliberate, the kind of smile people make when they've confirmed a theory. He held my gaze for just a second longer, then turned and ran, not out toward where the car was on the screen. He bolted straight for the door, sprinted across the lot, and disappeared off to the side of the store, in the direction of the woods. I rushed around the counter to the monitors, heart banging in my throat. On the rear camera I saw him, and at least one other figure, someone who'd been crouched behind the car, take off at full speed into the trees, their bodies slipping between trunks and vanishing into darkness like they knew the terrain by heart. The car just sat there with its dead headlights and closed trunk, silent and inert, like a prop they no longer needed. The alarm kept screaming until it finally cut out on its own, leaving the store weirdly silent. When the police arrived, 2 deputies and a state trooper, it was almost surreal how normal they looked standing under the humming fluorescence while my hands still shook. They checked the lot, the tree line, shone flashlights into the brush, but the woods swallowed sound and light the way they always did. And if the men were still out there, they were buried deep. Inside the store, one of the officers froze when he looked down at the counter. I hadn't noticed it in my rush. Near the register, on the side closest to the exit, someone had carved a single straight line into the laminate, about 4 inches long, thin and deliberate. It was too fresh to be old damage. You could still see the faint curl of plastic at the edges. It lined up perfectly with where my hand usually rested when I leaned forward to hand back change. The thought that someone had been close enough and calm enough to mark the exact spot where they'd wanted me to be made my skin crawl in a way the alarm hadn't. They walked me out to the car together, their flashlights cutting through the fog. Up close, the sedan looked ordinary, mid-range, a little dirty, no obvious damage. But when the trooper opened the passenger door, the interior light clicked on, revealing details that made my stomach turn. There was a blanket folded neatly in the back seat, along with a small duffel bag unzipped just enough to see rolls of duct tape, a pair of work gloves, and a bottle of heavy-duty cleaner. On the floor behind the driver's seat was a length of nylon rope coiled like it had been carefully placed there. And in the front passenger footwell, half tucked under the mat, was a printed map of the surrounding highways with a few locations circled in red ink. Our station was one of them. Somebody had planned that stop. Later, when they popped the trunk, I forced myself not to look too closely. I saw thick plastic sheeting, more rope, and a metal toolbox speckled with something dark that could have been oil, could have been rust, could have been anything. I didn't want to know. The deputies took my statement, copied the security footage, and had the car towed away. A few days later, they came back with an update that felt like something out of a bad movie. The sedan had been reported stolen almost a week earlier from a town over 100 miles away. No one had come forward to claim it. No missing persons tied to the plate. No fingerprints they could immediately match. Just a stolen car, packed with things no one uses for anything good, abandoned outside a gas station in the middle of the night. The part that got to me most wasn't the car itself, or even the men running into the woods. It was what we saw when we replayed the footage from the cameras that faced the pumps. On one angle, just before the guy in the hoodie came inside, you could see a third person sitting in the front passenger seat, turned slightly toward the driver, their face mostly in shadow. The door never opened on camera. The person never stepped out. But when the officers found the car, that same passenger door was latched, and the seat was empty. Somewhere between the grainy freeze frame and the search, that third person had vanished into the dark without leaving so much as a footprint on the cold, damp ground. People like to make jokes about haunted stations and cursed stretches of highway when they hear me tell this story, but there's nothing supernatural about it. It's much simpler and much worse than that. 3 living, breathing people spent days driving around those mountains in a stolen car, circling places like mine, planning. They had the tools, the timing, and the terrain on their side. I just had a panic button and one moment of listening to the part of my brain that said, "This doesn't feel right." That was months ago, and I don't work nights anymore. I transferred to a different job, one with actual coworkers and locks that don't open onto a wall of trees. Sometimes I still drive past that old station during the day. From the road, it looks harmless, almost pathetic, a small, tired building with faded signage, the kind of place you'd forget an hour after filling up. But I can't unsee that empty passenger seat, that carved line in the counter, that smile right before the alarm went off. Every time I hear about a missing person on the news, some girl who never made it home from a late shift or a guy whose car was found by the side of the road, my mind goes back to that night and the way those men ran into the Appalachia woods like they'd done it before. I think about how close I came to stepping outside with a flashlight and a stranger who just needed a little help. If you've ever worked alone at night, or if you've ever ignored that bad feeling because you didn't want to seem rude or paranoid, I'm curious, what would you have done in my shoes? Would you have gone out to check that car, or hit the panic button like I did? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the only thing that keeps me from spiraling is hearing what other people think they would have done in the same fluorescent, humming, too quiet room. Story 3. My name is Emily, and for almost a year, I worked the night shift at a big box store off a highway that cuts through the Appalachian foothills. If you drove past it in the daytime, it looked like any other sprawling superstore in any other small town, huge parking lot, endless rows of cars, kids begging for toys by the sliding doors, but at 2 or 3 in the morning it felt like something else entirely. Outside, the mountains turned into dark silhouettes pressed against the sky, and the fog from the river crept up and pooled in the low spots of the lot. Inside, the overhead lights hummed, the air vents rattled, and the aisles stretched out so long that standing in the middle of them, you could forget there were people anywhere on the planet but you. I usually worked in electronics, which meant that most nights were a slow drift of facing shelves, straightening phone chargers, and pretending to look busy while my brain floated somewhere else. By that hour, the only customers we usually saw were truckers getting supplies before heading back onto the highway, college kids on sugar runs, and the occasional local who seemed to live in their car. A lot of the time, it was just empty aisles, security cameras, and my own reflection in the dark TV screens. That night started like any other. Dead quiet. The store so still that every squeak of the shopping cart wheel sounded loud. Around 1 a.m., I was restocking memory cards, working halfway down the aisle, when I looked up at the convex mirror dome at the end. In it, my image bent in the curve of the glass. But behind me, way back at the intersection where electronics met toys, there was a tall shape. Just far enough that I couldn't see a face, just a hoodie, a frame, the sense of someone standing completely still and facing my direction. I turned around instinctively, expecting to see them there in real time, but the aisle behind me was empty. No footsteps, no cart, nothing. I told myself, it imagined it, that it was probably a display or the way the light bounced off something shiny. Still, I felt that little prickle between my shoulder blades, the one you get when you realize you can't see as far as you thought you could. A little later, I noticed him for real. At first I assumed he was just another late-night wanderer, the kind of guy who kills time flipping through bargain DVDs and never buys anything. But he didn't move like that. He had this way of hovering just at the edges of my vision, lingering in the next aisle over while I stalked, standing too still near the clearance end cap, pretending to look at a wall of headphones while his eyes kept tracking me. Every time I glanced up, he was there again. Not close enough for me to call him out, not far enough to ignore. He never picked anything up, never pushed a cart, never even pretended to compare prices. He just existed in my orbit, orbiting tighter and tighter. I thought about radioing for my manager, but when I reached for my walkie, all I got was a dead hiss. The batteries, which I'd meant to change at the start of my shift, had completely died. That feeling of being alone in a place full of cameras and policies suddenly felt very real. I started rehearsing what he'd say if he finally approached me. Some polite but firm line about being busy. When I felt a hand clamp around my arm, my whole body jolted. For a split second, I was sure it was him, but when I turned, I was staring into the smiling face of a woman I had never seen in my life. She had this bright, overdone friendliness, the kind of expression you put on for a family photo you don't want to be in. Her grip on my arm was warm and strong, too strong, her nails pressing crescents into my skin through my sleeve. In this loud, cheerful voice that carried down the aisle, she called me by a familiar nickname like we were old friends and launched into some rambling monologue about how she'd been looking for me everywhere, like we'd come in together and gotten separated. For everyone else, if there had been anyone else around, it would have looked like two friends reuniting after splitting up to shop. Then, without breaking that big social smile, she leaned in closer, her perfume sharp and sugary, and in a low, urgent voice told me the man had been recording me for a while. She said he'd been following me from aisle to aisle with his phone angled toward me, that she'd seen him zoom in on me more than once. My stomach dropped. I tilted my head just enough to look over her shoulder, and there he was, standing at the end of the aisle, no longer pretending to shop, just watching. From that distance, I couldn't see a phone in his hand, but I could feel the intention. Every instinct I had screamed at me to get away from him, and there she was, offering me a way out, already steering me gently by the arm. I let her pull me. I was grateful, honestly. I clung to the idea that someone decent had stepped up, that she'd noticed what no one else had and decided not to look away. As we moved, she kept up the act, talking loudly about totally normal things, weekend plans, a movie, some trip she supposedly took as if she were filling in the gaps for anyone who might be listening. I barely processed the words. My mind was stuck back there with that man and the idea of his phone pointed at my back. The woman walked fast, taking side aisles instead of the main runway through the store. At first, it made sense. I figured she was trying to keep us out of his line of sight. to lose him between shelves of detergent and plastic storage tubs. After a few turns, I risked a glance behind us and felt a wave of relief when I realized he wasn't there. Just empty aisles and stacks of merchandise. We'd gotten away, I thought. We were fine. That was when things started to feel off. She didn't slow down when it became clear he wasn't trailing us. She tightened her grip instead, just a fraction. Enough for me to feel the sharp edges of her nails digging more insistently into my skin. I told her I thought we were okay now, that maybe we should go find my manager or call security. She brushed it off with a quick reassurance, saying he was probably still lurking nearby and that she knew where the safest exit was. We moved past the registers, which were mostly empty at that hour, past the self-checkout stalls and their glowing screens, past the aisles that still had the occasional night stalker in them. With each step, the store got quieter, the hum of the vents louder, the overhead lights a little dimmer. Up ahead, I could see the warehouse doors, the swinging double doors that led to the storage area, and beyond that, the side exit employees used for loading trucks and taking out trash. That door didn't have cameras pointed directly at it. I knew that from the safety videos. As we passed a cleanup cart, I caught our reflection in a narrow steel panel, her smile wide and fixed, my face pale and uncertain. In that stretch of polished metal, her eyes looked different, flatter, calculating. It hit me then, all at once, that we were heading toward the one part of the building where no one would be watching. I dug my heels in. I told her firmly I wanted to go back toward the front, that there were cameras and people there, that I didn't feel right going near the loading docks. She kept smiling, but something behind it stiffened. Her hand didn't loosen. She told me we were almost there, that it was safer if he couldn't see us from the front of the store. The funny thing is, I wasn't scared of the man anymore. I was scared of her. I looked around and realized how empty it had become. The nearest co-worker was a distant shape in another department, bent over a cart, back turned. The night manager was probably in the office, out of sight. The only sound was the rolling rumble of a pallet jack somewhere in the back and the faint, tinny music from the store's speakers. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it. My brain was running through the statistics it heard in mandatory trainings and the news stories that started the same way this night had. For a split second, I pictured myself being pulled through that side door, shoved into some waiting van, the world narrowing to metal and dark and panic. Something in me snapped into place. I twisted my arm as hard as I could, using all the leverage Shed unintentionally given me by walking slightly ahead. Her nails scraped along my skin as I tore free, leaving hot, stinging crescents that I didn't fully feel until later. I didn't look at her face. I turned and ran toward the front of the store, toward the bright open spaces and the cameras, and the one coworker I could see behind me. Her voice cut through the air. She yelled after me. But it wasn't the words that chilled me, it was the fact that she yelled my name, my full first name, clear and sharp over the distant beeping of some forgotten scanner. I hadn't told her my name. I didn't wear a name tag in electronics because it kept catching on the shelving and my manager stopped caring. The only place in the store where my full name was written in big, clear letters was on the printed schedule board in the back hallway by the break room. I didn't stop to process that. I ran until I nearly collided with one of the guys from automotive, who turned wide-eyed at my expression. I told him what happened in a rush. The man, the woman, the way Shed tried to drag me toward the exit. He called security without hesitating. By the time store security and then the police arrived, the woman and the man were gone. No one matching their description was in the lot. No car that stood out. It was like they'd dissolved into the cold night air. I kept replaying the sound of my name coming out of that woman's mouth, the way it had cut through the empty space like Shed been waiting to use it, in the back office. We watched the security footage, and that's where the real horror started to settle in. On the screen, clear as day, we saw the man and the woman entering the store together about an hour before Id even noticed him near electronics. They didn't walk in side by side like a couple, but the timing was too close to be coincidence. In one camera angle near the front, the man grabbed a cart and started casually pushing it through the aisles while the woman veered off on her own. The cart itself bothered me. When we slowed the footage down and zoomed in, we could see what Head put in it. a pack of zip ties, a large roll of duct tape, a pair of cheap gloves, and 2 energy drinks. Nothing else. He never added anything more. Never swapped anything out. At one point, he parked the cart near a support column in the automotive section and walked away from it completely, leaving that neat little collection of items sitting alone in the frame. The woman, meanwhile, moved with a chilling kind of purpose. There she was on camera, drifting casually toward the back hallway that led to the break room and the employee-only area. She paused at the threshold, glanced over her shoulder once, then slipped through the door in the brief second someone else came out with a cart, holding it open long enough for her to slide in. She was in that hallway, our hallway, for almost 3 full minutes before she reappeared. When we zoomed in on the footage, we saw her stop in front of the whiteboard where our schedules were posted. She leaned in, phone in hand, and the bright rectangle of the screen flashed as she raised it. The image wasn't perfect, but you could make out enough. She was taking a picture of our schedule, of our names, of my name. Later, in the electronics footage, we saw moments I hadn't known about while I was in them. The man standing at the end of my aisle, phone up, the camera pointed at me as I bent to straighten shelves. The woman hovering in another aisle, watching from a distance. The angle of his arm made it clear he wasn't scrolling or checking messages. He was recording. In one frame, just before she grabbed my arm, you could see both of them in the same shot at opposite ends of the department, perfectly positioned to corner me without ever touching me at the same time. The part that made the hair on my arms stand up wasn't even the way they moved it, was the fact that this had been rehearsed. You could see it in the way they didn't talk to each other on camera, in the way they didn't waste time browsing. They'd walked the route before they ever approached me. From electronics, past the registers, down the quieter aisles, straight toward that side exit with no camera directly on it. When the police played the footage of me and the woman walking together, my body tensed. On screen, it really did look like 2 friends chatting. Her waving her free hand in the air as she talked, me nodding along, eyes darting back toward where I'd last seen the man. Only when we slowed it down did the truth stand out. The angle of her grip on my arm, the way her fingers dug in a little deeper each time I resisted, the way her eyes were always cutting ahead to where we were going, not back to where we'd been. And then there was the freeze frame that kept me up at night. It was just a still image from one of the dome cameras near the side exit, grainy and distorted a bit by the curve. In it, you could see the swing doors to the warehouse half open, and through that gap, the faint outline of someone standing near the loading dock door. We couldn't see a face, just the outline of a body in dark clothes, motionless, perfectly positioned behind the door where no customer would ever have reason to be. The timestamp put that person there 30 seconds before the woman started pulling me down that final stretch. 30 seconds. The report the police filed called it an attempted abduction. They said they'd use the man's face from the footage to try to track him down, that they'd run the woman through facial recognition if they could clean up a shot where she was looking straight at the camera. I nodded and answered their questions and signed what they needed me to. But no one was arrested that night. No cars were stopped in the lot. No one matching their descriptions showed up on the highway cameras they checked. It was like they'd slipped right back into the mountains and kept driving until they found another store, another night shift worker, another lonely aisle. I quit the graveyard shift not long after. I still work retail, but not at that store, and not past midnight. Even now, whenever I'm in a big box store late at night and I see a couple wandering who never put anything in their cart, or a stranger hovering in the next aisle over for just a little too long, my chest tightens. I think about that woman's nails digging into my arm and the way she said my name like she'd owned it for years. I think about how close I was to letting her walk me straight out of the bright, humming building and into whatever waited in the dark by that loading dock door. The scariest part is knowing they didn't pick me at random. They knew my name, my schedule, my department. They knew where the cameras were blind. They knew how far they could push before someone like me finally listened to that instinct that says something is very, very wrong. If you've ever worked nights, or been alone in a store and gotten that strange gut feeling about someone, I'm curious, what do you think you would have done if you were me? Would you have trusted the helpful stranger or brushed her off and stayed put? Tell me in the comments. because sometimes the only way I can make sense of how close it was is by hearing how other people think they'd handle the exact same kind of night.